a story that never once mentions God, the people of God find themselves exiled in a strange land under the rule of a foreign king. With their enemies plotting to destroy them, all hope appears to be absent. But one very unlikely character is raised to a position of remarkable power.
Well, if someone was going to ask you what are the most important, glorious truths of the Bible and what verses you would point to give evidence of those truths, and you could only pick two, which two in your mind would you go to? Now, for me, I have two quick answers to that. If someone said, what are the most glorious truths in the Bible for you? I would go first to Romans chapter 8, verse 28, where Paul says, and we know that God is working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. And in that short little verse, in one propositional little phrase, in one proposition, God, through Paul, puts forward the truth that he is sovereignly, providentially working through every circumstance of every moment of every day to bring about not only his purposes for his glory, but the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purposes. That has been a rock that my family has stood on through many a dark night. It's something that I love, that I cling to, that I believe in. And secondly, a close second, I would hang a left a few chapters and go to Romans chapter 5, verses 6, 7, and 8, where Paul says, and while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now, if you've been in the church, you've heard that verse before. If you've read your Bible, you've read that verse before. But for me, every time I read it, it just kind of stops me in my tracks. And I'm like, really? Because I know in my own life, as one biblical author wrote, a man might die for a good man, but to die for a bad man, that's a different kind of love. And I have a short list of people in my mind that I would unflinchingly jump in front of a speeding train for. And it's my wife, and it's my 4 children, and that's the list. Anybody below that list, I'd kind of have to think about it for a little bit, right? Let alone dying for somebody who's criticized me, ridiculed me, doubted me, ignored me, flipped me off, blown me off, written me off, disobeyed me, made fun of me. That guy is not going to get my life in his place. And yet, Paul teaches the glorious truth that while you were still a sinner, rebellious against God, God sent Jesus to die for you in your place. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Those would be my answers if someone put me on the spot and said, what are two of the most glorious truths in the Bible that you hang your hat on? And yet, I believe those truths. I love those truths. I've preached those truths. I've written of those truths. I've experienced those truths. I've preached of those truths. And yet, oftentimes, those truths are far from me. They are not close. They are not near. They are not clear. They are foggy, and they are distant, and they are fuzzy. And so for me, what I need is for the truth of God and the glorious truth of God's Word to be communicated and illustrated and have myself reminded of it 100 different ways, because I'm so apt to forget it. I'm so apt to not believe it. I'm so apt to lose it in the midst of the circumstances of life. And one of the reasons that God gave us the book of Esther was to take some of the most glorious truths imaginable in holy, sacred scripture and in the human experience, and to display them vividly in the lives of people we're going to read in a captivating story. To remind us again of those things that you and I so easily and quickly forget. So if you got your Bible, and I hope you do, I want to start at Esther chapter 1. And today is going to be a bit of an introduction to the book of Esther, so that as we work through the book of Esther and kind of fly over it the next several weeks together, we can have this as a framework in our mind for understanding what God's doing in this book. Esther chapter 1, verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. Now, let's just stop there real quick. That's staggering, right? If you threw a party, or if I threw a party to display the vast array and splendor of the glory of our kingdom, my party would last about 5 minutes, okay? He does this for 180 days because he's a big dude and he's a powerful guy. Verse 5, when these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material of silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. First thing we want to observe right out of the gate about the book of Esther, and this is going to blow your socks off, is this. The book of Esther is a story. Like I roll out of bed for that. Hang with me. The book of Esther is a story. And we got to just remind ourselves of that if we're going to read it rightly, because story is a powerful vehicle for God to communicate truth to us. But yeah, we oftentimes forget it because we're like the fish in water that doesn't realize how important water is to their existence. And so what I want to do briefly in the front end here is just take just a few moments to illustrate and to demonstrate the power of story and why story is so powerful. Story is powerful, number one, because story surrounds us. Story surrounds us. Story is everywhere we live in our human experience. We doubt in story, we worry in story, we anticipate in story, we hope in story, we criticize in story, we get angry in story, we hate in story, we plan in story, we gossip in story, we learn in story, we remember in story, we make plans in story. We can't help not live in story. It's everywhere we go. When we were born and we were young, we didn't cut our teeth reading, Socrates and Plato and philosophy books and rhetoric. We started reading stories because we are surrounded by and we live in and we interact with and we respond most naturally to story, which is so wonderful that God would then choose to communicate some of the most important things in the world in the form of story that we understand. Secondly, the power of story is that it engages us. It awakens our imagination, it fires our creativity, and we begin thinking of things that we would not have thought otherwise. I remember with our children growing up, Elena was 4, Levi was 2. They didn't want food at night. They didn't want water at night. They didn't want a bath at night. They wanted one thing at night, and it was a story. They wanted me to tell them a story. And I'd be like, oh man, here we go again. I don't think I'm a very good storyteller. My dad is a legendary storyteller, so he'll tell these 45, 50-minute stories with all the characters involved, and all the kids got their own special names, and he'll have them on the edge of their seat for 50 minutes, leave them hanging on the ragged edge of suspense, and do that 3 nights in a row. I mean, like part 1, part 2, part 3 of the adventures of the Mac kids in the Himalayan mountains. I mean, just crazy, epic, imaginative stories. My imagination is pathetic. My ability to tell a story is small. And so my kids would ask, and I'd be like, okay, here we go. And I'd make up, Elame and Levi went out hunting for mushrooms, and then they found some. I mean, that's what I can do. But the second I could tell a dumb, simple story, but the second I put them in the story, they're engaged, they're awake. Then what happens next, Dad? Because we were built for story. Because story engages us. The most profound man to walk the planet, who stands head above and shoulders above the other 60 billion plus people who've walked the earth, Jesus Christ, took 3 years in his teaching ministry, and when he taught and when he preached and he opened his mouth, what did he do in his teaching? He told stories. He told stories. A sower went out into a field to sow a field. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. There was a rich man one day. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. There was a man who prepared a great wedding feast, so on and so forth. Jesus understood the impact of story because it engages us, because he made us to respond that way. Story is powerful, thirdly, because it connects us. Story connects us. You may never have thought of this, but story is connecting you every day to people around you. You meet somebody new, and the first thing you ask them is, hey, tell me about yourself. And what you don't expect is this propositional, list of facts about them. I'm 6'2", I weigh 220 pounds, which means I'm currently 30 pounds overweight. I'm 38 years old. I mean, it's like nobody wants to hear that. Like, I don't want to hear that from me. And then, those are facts. We assume that when you ask them, hey, tell me about yourself, they're going to select certain narratives from their life and communicate those stories to you that give them a good idea of who they are. When I come home at night to my family, we're at the dinner table, and Brown Eyes is there, my beautiful, and LMA is there, and Levi Gregory is there, and Amelia Claire is there, and Gideon Joshua is there, and I ripping a playbook out of one of the more godly men I know, my youth pastor, Pastor Kent, and I say, hey, what were highs and lows today? And we go around the table and we share highs and lows from the day. And what my kids don't do is rattle off a set of facts. What my kids do is recount the narrative in prose form of their day. They start telling me stories about their day that were meaningful or significant. I've never taught them that. I've never trained them that. It's built into the DNA of humanity to love engaging and connecting through story. Isn't it wonderful that when God wanted to connect with us, he wrapped his story in the form of this story? So that when we read Esther, we're asking God, well, what does this tell us about you? Tell us about yourself, God. Tell us about who you are and what you're doing and who we are in light of that and who we're called to be. Because God, when he goes to communicate things that are important, he does it in the way that we most openly and readily understand, and that is story. But stories do more than that. The power of story exists, and it's true because stories instruct us. Stories instruct us. And God knows this because he made us this way. Have you ever noticed when the infinite God wanted to communicate and reveal himself to finite man, he told a story? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He didn't drop the Bible out of the sky like a 3,000-page, 23-volume, RCW set of thou shalt and thou shalt not, so we got to memorize and follow. He graciously, lovingly, wisely gave us a story that we can read. And this story is made up of 66 different books, all weaving together to cohesively and coherently and consistently tell one single story. Stories instruct us. For instance, stories have the ability to take timeless truths and translate them across cultures, across races, across geopolitical boundaries, across, ethnic and economical differences. For instance, you could tell your children, thou shalt not lie. Or you could tell your children the story of Ananias and Sapphira, right? The story in the book of Acts where they bring their money to the apostles and they say it's all they have, but they're really lying because they want to make a name for themselves and rob God. And Peter calls them out and they deny it and God strikes them dead. Gideon. See how that works? You could tell your kids, hey, don't screw around and screw people that you're not married to. Don't go out and have sex outside of marriage. That's going to mess them up and mess you up. Don't mess up God's design for sexuality. Don't commit adultery. You could do that, or you could just read them the story of David and Bathsheba and see how it goes for David. when he thinks of being the most powerful man in the world, excuses him from living in the safety confines of God's design for sexuality. So he goes and he robs a woman from another man, has her as his own, and the story goes downhill from there. And for the rest of his life, he's living with the dire consequences of his chosen sexual ethic outside of God's design. He thought he could excuse himself from because he was king. Or you could tell your kid, hey, the wages of sin is death. Or you could read them the story of Achan in the book of Joshua, where after capturing enemy lands, he takes what was supposed to be consecrated to God, steals it for himself, hides it in his tent, and then God brings consequences of the entire Israelite army because of the sin of one man until he's rooted out, confesses to it, and he is put to death because God will not put up with disobedience and unrighteousness among his people. Whoa. Yeah, God takes righteousness pretty seriously. So you can state truths like, hey, thou shalt not covet, or you can tell your kids a story of Cain and Abel. A story of sibling who coveted what his other sibling had, and it ended in murder. So stories communicate and carry truth that translates across cultural barriers, so that when we read this story of Esther, it can instruct us 2,500 years later because of the truth being carried in the vehicle of story that God created. Story not only instructs us, story is powerful because story implicates us. Story implicates us. When we read story, we find ourselves connecting with the challenge or the temptation or the fear or the anxiety or the dilemma of the people in the story. And we have an emotional response. We're like, I've felt that. Oh man, I've been there. Ooh, what would I do? Stories implicate us. Stories draw us in, they engage us, they open us up, but then they turn on us in a way that helps us see things we would not have seen. For instance, when David takes Bathsheba for his own, and then David goes and kills her husband to cover up his sin of rape and adultery, and then thinks he's gotten away with it. And a few months pass, and then the prophet Nathan shows up at the palace. Nathan, what's up, bro? Knuckles, punch it out. How's it going? It's going good, David. Can I tell you a story? Sure, love stories. Let her rip. Here's how the story goes. There's a man in your kingdom who had hundreds and thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats. He was a rich man who had a friend over for a party a few weekends ago. But instead of taking one of the hundreds and thousands of cattle or sheep or lamb and goats that he owns, he went down to his servants' quarters, who only had one lamb that was his servant's prized possession. And he took that lamb from him, went back to his own house, slaughtered that lamb, and fed his friends at his own party. And David, in this self-righteous sense of justice, comes off his throne and he says, you give me the name of that man and I will have his head on a platter before the sun goes down. That kind of rank, sick injustice will not go unpunished in my kingdom. And Nathan points his bony finger at David and says, David, you're the man. And David has nowhere to go. If Nathan would have come in, hey, did you screw another man's wife? Did you steal what was rightfully his? Did you commit sexual sin and perverse adultery in the eyes of God? What do you think? David's going to defend, posture, hey, excuse, get out all day long. Nathan weaves a story, draws an emotional response out of David, drops the hammer, and David breaks like a twig. I have nowhere to go. I am guilty because David was implicated in a story that drew out of him an emotional response he couldn't ignore. There's power in story. There's power in story. And that's why God chose to communicate some of the most glorious truths in the world in the form of story. So, that is a bit of a flavor of why the power of the story of Esther grips us as it is going to in the future, because story is powerful. So, what's the purpose of Esther? What's the purpose of Esther? 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, gives us the answer to the question, what's the purpose of Esther? Paul's writing to Timothy, he says as follows, "But as for you, Timothy, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know from those whom you learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus." Paul's saying if you read the book of Esther in the context of the canonical context of the Old Testament, it will give you the path to Jesus Christ. And then he says the following, "All Scripture is God-breathed, including Esther, and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work." So of all the things that we might not know about Esther or might be confused about Esther, what we don't need to be confused about is why Esther was given to us. Esther was given to us to point us to Jesus, who is the way of salvation, and it was given to us as the God-breathed Word of God himself to equip us as a church in 2018 as the people of God living on mission together, to equip us for every good work God might call us to. Isn't that helpful? It's helpful to know why God gave us the book of Esther. The other reason that God gave us the book of Esther, in Romans chapter 15, Paul wrote as follows, "For everything that was written in the past, including Esther he's speaking of, was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the story of Esther, in the Scriptures, and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope." So whatever else we don't understand about Esther, what we do know is that for some reason, somehow, some way, it was given to you and I that we might have hope to endure whatever hardships may come our way. And I don't know about you, but I got hardships coming my way. Maybe you live in like a glass bubble and like you're 6 minutes old, so you've never had a hardship. But other than that, you've experienced hardship. It's just coming. It's just the way it is. And Paul's saying, God gave you Esther and the book of Esther to read in the context of God's story to give you hope. And that's kind of encouraging. I'm like, well, I want to read the book of Esther now. So therein lies what we know to be the God-inspired purpose of Esther. So what are the particulars of Esther? We've seen the power of Esther's story, the purpose of Esther to give us hope and to equip us for every good work. What are the particulars of Esther we should be aware of? Well, particular number one is that Esther is selective in detail. You just need to know that out of the gate that Esther is not a stream of conscience recounting of every event that happened, in the years 486 BC to 456 BC. When biblical writers are writing scripture, they're good storytellers, which means they're selective in the information they share. And you intuitively know that good storytellers only give you certain pieces of information. Bad storytellers include way too much detail that deludes the point and confuses everybody. And every parent who's had a 3-year-old knows this, right? What'd you do with Mommy at the store today? We got in the car. She looked for her keys. She looked more for her keys. She answered the phone. She turned the key and the car went vroom. And you're like, I'm going to be here 17 years just to get to the store. And then what's so funny to watch is as kids grow, they don't take classes in this. They intuitively learn to edit out information that isn't appropriate for the story to have meaning. They learn to take out stuff that doesn't matter and get to the point that matters. That's called authorial editing. That's how we all work, right? And that is the same of the story of Esther. It's selective in its detail, which means every word, every phrase, and every detail matter. They are not their backs. We just read the first 9 verses of Esther, and most of you got lost and bored. Xerxes, king, citadel, Susa, party, who cares? Every phrase, every word, every detail was there given for a purpose to paint a more complete picture of the story that was given and intended to communicate something. So good storytellers are selective in detail. Secondly, in the particulars of Esther, those details are specific in arrangement. They're specific in arrangement, meaning the author not only selects what he will put in and not put in, he selects how he puts them in and how he arranges them. So as we read through Esther, which I'm hoping you're reading on your own, as you read through Esther so you're familiar with the story, don't miss the order in which the author arranges things. So, for instance, one way to organize the book of Esther is in couplets or doublets, they call them, of twos. Things happen in twos in Esther. There's 2 kings. There's 2 queens. There's 2 banquets. There's 2 sets of counselors. There's 2 kings' edicts given. There's 2 kings' orders disobeyed. There's 2 races or ethnic groups that are against each other. There's 2 plots that are foiled. On and on it goes. There's sets of 2s throughout the book of Esther. That's intentionally arranged by the author to set 2 things together so they can be compared and contrasted. So that the brightness of one character might be more fully seen when it's compared to the dullness or darkness of the other. That's intentional storytelling. Another way that the book is organized is around the motif of banquets. I said there are 2 banquets in the story, which is true. There are 2 major banquets that are compared to each other, but there are actually 8 to 10 banquets in the story, depending on how you read the events of the story. And nothing significant happens outside of a banquet. Everything significant, everything that's big, every big announcement, every big revelation, every big twist and plot turn in the story happens in the context of a banquet, which then should cause us as astute readers to go, what's up with the banquets? What's up with the banquet thing? How come this banquet theme keeps cropping up? Obviously, the author would only include detail that's relevant to the big idea of the story, and he keeps including the word banquet. In fact, the word banquet is used 22 times in the book of Esther alone, used 24 times in the rest of the Old Testament. So half of the references to banquets are found in Esther. Selective in detail, intentional in how they are arranged. Third particulars of Esther is its setting. Esther is set in Susa. Look at what happened. This is what happened. This is a historical account. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were there. Now here's the historical significance of the setting that the author in the first 3 verses just set or couched our entire story. Nebuchadnezzar is king of Babylon, world power. They come in and conquer and thrash and ransack Israel. They take the Israelites captive. They destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. Israel, God's people, now as a result of their sin and their disobedience to God, in answer to God's prophetic word against them, he's disciplining them through King Nebuchadnezzar, captures them, takes them into captivity. King Nebuchadnezzar dies. King Belshazzar comes to the throne, still exercising a heavy hand of rule and authority over Israelites living in exile from their homeland and living in captivity to Babylon. In the east, another king is rising, King Cyrus. And King Cyrus the Great, he sends his troops down the Euphrates River, and on October 12th, as it's told, I think it was 572 BC, they get in the river and get inside the castle of Babylon. And while King Belshazzar is throwing this massive party and drunken orgies, they, without firing a single arrow, capture Babylon and conquer the Babylonian Empire. And now it's the rise of the Persian Empire. And King Cyrus is brilliant in his infrastructure, and highways begin getting built, and a postal system gets built that we built our Pony Express off here in the United States. And then he dies, and King Darius comes to the throne. You might recognize him from the stories of Daniel. And then he dies, and King Xerxes comes to the table. He comes into power at 34. He dies at age 54, being killed at night by assassins in his bed. But for 20, 30 some odd years, he reigns with an iron hand. He's a genius tactician, military conqueror. He's spreading Persia north, south, east, west. North up into up into Asia Minor there. South down into Egypt and Africa. East towards Asia, and then he tries to go west across the Mediterranean to take on Athens and Greece, and they get locked in kind of this epic, empire struggle for several years. This is why you should probably recognize, or at least know who he is. This is recognizable historic information and events that the story of Esther is taking place inside of. If you've seen the movie 300, which I don't know if it's good or not, I haven't seen it, so this is not a recommendation. From the trailers, it looks like it's a bunch of guys that do too much CrossFit and women that don't wear enough clothes. So I don't think you should watch it. But the King Xerxes in the movie that conquers King Leonidas, That's this Xerxes. So the big, tall, attractive, mighty warrior king of Persia that conquers the Spartan 300s, that's the guy that Esther sleeps with. So this is like right in the center of epic world historical events. There is not a more powerful man in a more powerful kingdom than King Xerxes, and that's the guy at the heart of this story. Crazy to note that all of this epic empire struggle for global domination between Persia and the Greeks is happening during the book of Ezra, during the book of Nehemiah, and during the book of Esther, and not once is it mentioned. Because in light of what God is doing, epic global struggles pale. Other historical events going on during the book of Esther that you might find interesting. A Chinese philosopher during the book of Esther is born by the name of Confucius in the East. Oh, yeah. To the west in Palestine and Greece is coming into its sort of golden age. Well, Nehemiah's rebuilding the walls, and Ezra's reading the law, and Esther's trying to avoid, ethnic genocide. Pericles is shaping the political system in Athens that will become the basis for modern democracy. Sophocles is writing plays that we still read and reenact today. Socrates is born in the same time as the story of Esther takes place. Pythagoras starts a school and discovers his mathematical theorems that become the foundation for algebra and geometry that we still use to this day. The foundations for Western culture, from democracy to art to athletics, are being laid and being born right in the middle of Esther. During the story of Esther, the Olympics are 200 years into their run. And during the time of Esther, the Greeks add an event to the Olympic Games called the foot race. Esther is happening right in the middle of massively important historical events that we're still living in light of to this day. And they never once mention them. Because there's something bigger afoot than some guy finding a mathematical theorem that we build algebra on. God's at work. God's at work. Now, having said all of that, the power of Esther's story, the purpose of Esther in being for our good and for our hope and for our edification as a church, the particulars of Esther that we need to be aware of, and the details that are specifically arranged in the historical context to make the point. Here's the problem with Esther. Now, Esther is problematic. For the first 700 years in church history, not one commentary was written on the book of Esther. John Calvin, one of the greatest commentaries in church history, never preached a single sermon on the book of Esther, nor wrote a single commentary on the book of Esther. Luther wished it was ripped from its canon. It has been the source of questions. It has been the source of why is this here? And there's a reason that Esther is so problematic. And one of the primary reasons that Esther is so challenging for interpreters and preachers alike is Esther. Esther is one of the main problems. Because, see, we've learned to read our Bible wrongly. We read it and we look for moral fairy tales of characters that we can be like or not be like. So we turn our Bible into Aesop's fable where it's be like David or be like Nathaniel or be like Moses or be like Daniel or be like Esther. Then we read the story and that breaks down because it could be argued that nobody should try to be like Esther. Now, she's not a flat character. She's a developing character, a very nuanced character. She gets some of the most press in the book, and so I think we're going to see Esther change. But in no stretch of the imagination is Esther like this polished, neat, clean, shining armor, Captain America or Captain Persia or whatever. That's just not her. And I started to watch the movie One Night with the King, and I got 20 minutes, and I'm like, oh my gosh, turn it off. Don't watch the movie if you want to get the book. Now, I haven't watched the whole thing, so that's not fair to say. I'm just saying where it was going, I don't think it was going to be helpful. Because there can be prejudices we can come to the book of Esther with that then cause us to miss what is actually happening. For instance, unlike most biblical characters that have hero status, Esther unlike Daniel, absolutely ignores and shows no concern for the dietary laws of Moses when she's taken to the pagan courts of the king to live there for a year. Esther lies about her identity and then plays to win in the Persian beauty contest that was like American Idol meets The Bachelorette, you know? It's like Persian Idol meets The Bachelorette. She wins the pole dancing contest to like please the king, has sex with an uncircumcised pagan Gentile, pleases him in bed, gets chosen among all of the other virgins, and that's the girl you want your girl to be like? Can you see why saying be like Esther is a little challenging when you actually read the book? She's morally ambiguous at best for most of the story. Well, doesn't she bravely and courageously go to the king? Yeah, after she gets threatened with her own skin in danger. She doesn't voluntarily go to the king. It's not until Mordecai points out that she might be at risk herself that she decides to go talk to the king about this little problem that they have. And then after the king listens to her and changes the edict against the Jews, they might defend themselves, when she finds out that 500 Gentiles were killed and massacred by Jews defending themselves, she asks for the day to be extended another 24 hours so that more Jews could kill more Gentiles, and she asks for all of Haman's 10 sons to be stuck on pig poles out at the city gate. There is an uncomfortable bloodlust in the character of Esther that makes it slightly difficult to say everyone should be like Esther. There's a reason that for 700 years, not one person wrote a commentary on this book, and it's not in a small part to the challenging character of Esther and the moral ambiguity of the one in whom the book is named after. She was not a victim. She chose to engage in this sex competition for the affections of a king. But there's more to the book that's problematic, and that is Mordecai. Well, he's a wise man credited with taking a bad situation and certain defeat and turning it to victory, the ultimate lemons to lemonade. And I'm like, well, who here would want Mordecai as their kid's uncle? Because Mordecai he's a cousin to Esther. She's orphaned. He takes her in and takes care of her. And it's Mordecai who convinces her to abandon her Jewish roots, to ignore the dietary laws, and to go take part in the sex competition. That was Mordecai's idea. It's Mordecai who is the one who, because of his petty refusal to bow before Haman, literally puts the entire race of the Jewish nation in jeopardy because of a petty argument he got in with a guy and the honor that he refused to give somebody that was rightfully that guy's anyways because of his position in the kingdom. The same Mordecai who probably threatened Esther in order to motivate her to go do something noble. You say, why do you say that? It's not spoken of explicitly in the text, but when you read the story, and Mordecai is talking with Esther, who has successfully hidden her Jewishness from the Persian king for how many years? And he says, look, here's the deal. If this edict requiring Jews to be killed is carried out, your life will be at stake and you will lose your life. You got to go talk to him. Now, why would Esther's life be in danger? Because nobody but her knew that she was a Jew, except for Mordecai. And so you can't help but wonder, why would Mordecai say her life was in jeopardy unless there was a subtle threat of ratting her out unless she did something? Now, the text does not say that explicitly. And Mordecai is not condemned with that accusation, but neither is he exonerated from that implication. The text is just silent, which is why you can begin to see this sordid tale, absent of any religious values, strong with sensuality and violence, and moral ambiguity in the lives of the heroes, becomes a little challenging to be this little cut and dry churchy story. Esther was courageous. You should be courageous, girls. Mordecai was wise. You should be wise, guys. Who wants Mordecai as their kid's cousin? Not me. And I'm not giving you my slanted opinion. I'm telling you why nobody wrote commentaries for 700 years on it. It's a tough book to figure out. But there's one more problem with the book of Esther that's probably the biggest challenge. And it's not what is included in the book, it's what's excluded in the book. The biggest problem of Esther isn't what's written in Esther, it's what's excluded in Esther. Meaning, Esther's the only book in which there is no reference to God. But more than that, there's no reference to the temple of God. There's no reference to the place of God in Jerusalem. Nobody ever prays to God. No prophetic utterance is ever issued from God. No apocalyptic vision is given from God. No miracles are performed by the power of God. There are no prophets speaking on behalf of God. It is an absolutely and utterly 100% godless book. No prayers, no prophets, no priests, no prophetic vision, no sacrifices, no temple, no Jerusalem, no God at all, no reference to the law, no adherence to or respect for the law. It is an absolutely 100% godless book. In fact, one commentator said, if you took the Jews out of the book, you wouldn't even know it should be in the Bible. There is nothing that distinctly marks it as a God-centered book. But therein lies the book's genius. Because as we read the story of Esther these next 8 to 9 weeks, we're going to see the book of Esther asking 2 primary questions. Because as we bring questions to the book of Esther, one of the questions we want to ask is, what's the book of Esther asking? What's the story of Esther asking? And the 2 primary questions that the story of Esther is asking is, number 1, is God still with us even when we don't see him? Is God still with us even when we don't see him? You got to get the context. Remember, this is the people of God under the discipline of God because they rebelled against God, who were ripped from the place of God in captivity, and they are there now, and everywhere they look, they see the circumstances going bad. The king is against us, this edict is against us. In 3 days, unless something changes, we are going to die. And the singular question that Esther is asking as she walks towards the palace, no matter what moral ambivalence has happened behind her or moral ambiguity in the decisions and motives that she's made, she is now attempting to do what she believes to be right in saving her life and her people's life. And as she walks towards the palace, what she's asking herself is God still with me even if I can't see him? No prophets, no priests, no temple, haven't worshiped him in years, haven't obeyed his law in years. Is he still going to be with me? But it's not just Esther asking that question. There's an entire people of God asking that question. We've been taken in captivity. We're about to be slaughtered and massacred here in a few days. Is God still with us even though we can't see him? That's the question that's ringing through the intrigue-filled, sex-filled, money-filled, power-filled, deceit-filled, assassination plot-filled, plot twist-turning-filled story of Esther. And yet the genius of Esther is not that we see only Esther asking that question or the people of God asking that question, but as we read the story, we begin getting implicated ourselves in realizing that that's a question I've asked 100 times in my life too. You see, the question that the book of Esther is asking is not unique to Esther or unique to the people of God in captivity. It's the experience of humanity living in a fallen world. Is God still with me even though I can't see him? And I'm guessing that many, if not most of you, have had circumstances in life, have had events in life, have had seasons in life, have had things happen in life where God is nowhere to be seen. You can't see him, you can't hear him. And you're going, really? I mean, I know you're busy and lots of stuff going on, but you said you loved me, and I've been trying my best here, and I feel only abandoned. I feel only alone. I feel only the absence of God, and I want to know, is he still here? Because as I look at the circumstances of my life right now, or as I look at the last 3 or 4 days, or last 3 or 4 weeks, or last 30 or 40 years, I can't see him. And I'm beginning to question the loyalty and the power and the sovereignty and the love of this God who said he was covenantally connected to me and promised to, do what's best for me. But that's not the only question the book of Esther asks. Because the second question the book of Esther asks is not just, is God still with us even though we can't see him, but it's, will God deliver us even if we're in captivity? As Esther's walking to the palace, she's thinking, okay, interesting. We've been in captivity, haven't been obeying God's laws. When in Rome, do what the Romans do. That's kind of what I've been doing. Yeah, how's this going to work for me? Have my past choices in sin disqualified me from being delivered by God? But that's not just Esther's question. That's Israel's question. Because the people of God in captivity are going, this is interesting. In captivity, as a result of our sinful rebellion choices against God, and now there's an edict for our massacre. There's an edict for our genocide. And we have no expectation that God should deliver us based on our own actions, because all we have done is sin and rebel against him and ignore his laws. And so the question is, will God deliver us even though we're in captivity? And that's where the genius of Esther impacts us even as it implicates us, because that's the question every person has asked in the dark of night, alone with their own heart and soul. Would there be one who would be willing to save me and deliver me in spite of what I've done? Because see, you and I, brothers and sisters, even though we look at this story and at first think, I'm glad I'm not like them, upon further reflection we'll find that we too have lived in captivity of our own choosing because of our own sin. We were born into captivity and then we chose to stay there, and the question becomes, will God save me even though I am in captivity of my own choosing? Or will the past decisions that I have made and the past sin and the past mistakes disqualify me from God's delivering work? To which God responds. There's Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God is working for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. In Romans 5, verse 7 and 8. And while we were yet still sinners, Christ died for us. The resounding message of Esther, demonstrated in 10,000 different ways through the story, is that in the seeming hour of God's conspicuous absence, he is still most powerfully, providentially, omnipotently present. That even when we cannot see God, he is absolutely still at work, governing all things towards his appointed end. And that God is doing his extraordinary work through ordinary people in the everyday circumstances of life, in spite of their own brokenness. Because you see, the glaring absence in the book of Esther makes its biggest point. You can't understand Esther on its own. All the exegetical work in the world will not mine out the truth of Esther because it's not there. It's just not there. There's no internal motivation revealed. There's no commentary. There's no point made. It's just a story, and a godless story at that. And left on its own, Esther can't be understood rightly in light of who God is and what he's doing. And neither can your life. Esther is like the events of your life. There are so many events and circumstances and days and seasons and years that you simply will not be able to understand on its own. To understand Esther, we have to step back and read Esther in light of the entire biblical canon and the story of God, so that then we see the faithfulness of God in the story of Esther being spoken by Paul hundreds of years later. Because the good news of Esther, that Esther couldn't see, that is, without Esther, there is no good news. Unless God did an extraordinary work through ordinary circumstances and broken people, the Jews would not have survived, the seed of David would not have been preserved, and King Jesus would have never showed up. Esther didn't see any of that in her story while she was alive. And sometimes you will not be able to see the sovereign, providential, gloriously powerful and present hand of God in your story. That does not mean he is not there. The banner and flag that the book of Esther waves is that your life can't be understood on its own, just like the book of Esther. Your life has to be understood in the totality of what God is doing in the light of his redemptive and covenantal promises to you through Christ. And the banner that the book of Esther waves is that in the hour of God's seemingly conspicuous absence, he is powerfully and profoundly present. That when you think you do not deserve God to show up and act, he will show up and act because he's God. Not because you're good, not because you've deserved it, but because he made a promise to you that he plans to keep. That God will do extraordinary works through ordinary people in the normal circumstances of everyday boring life to bring about profound works of deliverance. So who's the story of Esther for? If you've ever had the thought, where in the world is God? What in the world is he doing? Why would he let that happen? Why wouldn't he do this? Why wouldn't he do that? Has he abandoned me? Has he forgotten me? Has he left me alone? Why did he let that happen? Why didn't he stop that? If you've ever asked those questions, then the book of Esther was written for you. It's a 10-chapter demonstration in living color of the beauties of Romans 8:28. That God is working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And if you've ever asked, could God deliver me from the captivity I've chosen for myself? If you've ever wondered, I wonder if my past sin disqualifies me from future ministry with Jesus because I see things I want to do. I have people I want to reach. I have a church I want to join, but they don't know what I've done. And I'm not sure if my past disqualifies me from my future, then the book of Esther is for you. In reminding you across 10 chapters of the one verse reality that while you were still a sinner, Christ died for you. Meaning your salvation isn't anchored and rooted in your works. It's anchored and rooted in the work of Jesus, who delivered you from your self-imposed captivity because he's God and he's there, even when you can't see him. And my heart's heavy for those who are here, who are in a circumstance of life going, you know what? What is the deal? I want you to read Esther. I want you to hear God saying, in the middle of my conspicuous absence, I'm powerfully present. You might not see it for a week or a year or a lifetime, but you can know that it's true and you can build your life on it. Which means if you see that truth and embrace that truth, and if that truth settles into your soul, you will experience what Paul wrote was the purpose of Esther hundreds of years later. To help you see Jesus, to help equip you for every good work, and to help anchor you in hope, giving you the ability to unflinchingly face whatever circumstances comes your way when you walk out this door in about 8 minutes. Because there's a hope that you and I can have that runs deeper than the darkest circumstances, however godless they may appear. And that's the good news of the story of Esther. And so, Father, I pray over these precious people, Lord, that you would open our eyes, that you would help us see and realize and remember that even in your seeming absence, you are present. Lord, would you use this story? Would you use this woman? Would you use these circumstances captured in this epic story of intrigue? Would you use this story to instruct your people and to remind us as your church that you have plans for us and that you've commissioned us to do something and that you have not left us alone to do it, but that you walk with us and are near to us. And Father, I pray specifically for any person here who is carrying a specific burden. They're staring at circumstances outside of their control, wondering what has happened, that you would gently and lovingly and graciously remind them today that you have not gone anywhere, that you've not dropped anything, that you've not forgotten one thing. You are working all things toward the good of those who love you and are called according to your purposes. And Father, even though we may not see you like we don't see you in the book of Esther, give us faith to hang on to that truth. Give us faith that would carry us through the dark night of our circumstances, that we might, as a people, demonstrate a hope that supersedes circumstances because of who you are and what you've done. In Jesus' name.